This episode of FinCrime Unfiltered with Sarah Beth Felix is brought to you by Castellum.AI, the real-time AI agents and screening platform keeping banks, fintechs, and governments ahead of financial crime. Whether you're navigating sanctions or watch lists, Castellum.AI helps you move fast and stay compliant. No outdated databases, no manual processes, just lightning-fast intelligence you can rely on. Visit Castellum.AI to see why compliance teams are making the switch. That's Castellum.AI. Hi, and welcome to FinCrime Unfiltered. I'm Sarah Beth Felix. Thank you so much for joining us again. This is episode 19. Episode 17 and episode 18 have actually already been published. Those are the two live digital events I did with the always fantastic Jim Richards. That was sponsored by our friends over at Thomson Reuters and Clear. And so if you haven't checked those out yet, please go look at those. Jim and I covered some timely stuff going on in the news. We had kind of a big news week last week. So Jim and I tackled those. So if you get a chance, if you could check that out, please keep us in mind. If you have questions about things, I keep getting emails about different forms and templates I've offered throughout the all of the episodes. And our email address is fincrimeunfiltered@illicitedge.com. Of course, you can always find me on LinkedIn at I Follow Dirty Money. But today's episode, singular, I wanted to address a few ongoing issues that never seem to really get a lot of airtime or play, because I think people kind of space out as soon as you get into the granular, or people think it's trivial and it's not worth talking about given the vast issues that we're dealing with in the financial crime space. And I'm thankful that Castellum is sponsoring today's event, because I want to dive right into sanctions and data. But first, we have to talk about data before we talk about sanctions. So usually when I bring this up, please don't turn off the episode, because we're going to dive into some nitty-gritty stuff. And I've already received several emails about a comment I made on a post several weeks ago regarding the differences in country codes. So please hear me. If you are a financial institution of any kind, a TradFi, don't get the glazed over look, but we're going to talk about country codes that are IRS country codes in your core system versus ISO country codes in your AML and sanctions world. In the sanctions and AML world, we deal with global ISO country codes, which are not the same as the country codes that the IRS uses, and what core bank system providers use, because they're using it for different purposes. They're usually using it for tax reporting purposes from the IRS perspective. And while it may seem trivial or too granular or boring, to me it's quite fascinating, because there are a lot of differences, not just from a sanctioned country perspective, but also from a higher risk country perspective. When we look at countries that could be selected from the drop-down menu in the passport ID field in a core banking system, and how that gets translated over to the AML system, which uses ISO country codes, and the differences I'm seeing. And I see this, I've seen it for years. I had an old article, I think I went back and found it like 7 years ago, so don't laugh at how I used to write. We all change and grow. But 7 years ago, I wrote an article about this issue, and I keep bringing it up. I just don't want people to kind of tune out, because it is super granular, because it's super, super important. And it could be the difference between knowing whether or not you're dealing with an individual that is the citizen of a country that we have sweeping sanctions against, or it could be the difference in whether or not a customer actually makes it onto your high-risk customer radar. And so I just want to kind of go through some of the top differences I see between IRS country codes that are in your core system and ISO country codes that are in your sanctions and AML system. Oftentimes, there's not a translator that sits between the two, so we see the differences when we pull the source data from the core, compare it to the data that's in the AML or sanctions system, there's always a discrepancy when we're dealing with some countries. So one of the first ones that comes to mind is Russia. So the country name clearly is Russia, and it's the same country name in ISO or IRS. However, the IRS country code is RS. When that gets translated into the AML system using the ISO country name, that is actually Serbia. Serbia's ISO country code is RS. So if we just use that one thing, that one example of Russia, and I've seen this in different community banks where they will have a list from the core that shows that, John Doe has a Russian passport, and that translates into the AML system as a Serbian person and not a Russian person. So there's differences there. There's differences with North Korea. North Korea's IRS country code is KN, and in the ISO world, KN is actually St. Kitts and Nevis. Beautiful place, not North Korea, but that's a huge issue, and that could be a sanctions problem. There's a whole bunch more discrepancies. I'd be happy to send you the list. I've already sent out several over the years, but basically I've appended all of the IRS and all the ISO country codes, and I've found all the discrepancies. There are issues with Ukraine, issues with Belarus, issues with Burma, things like that. I could go on, but moving beyond the sanctioned piece, the high-risk customer, high-risk country piece that plays into your high-risk customer criteria is also something that you have to be aware of, because it's not just a sanctions issue. We know that El Salvador in the IRS country code is ES, but ES equals Spain in the ISO country code. China is one I talk about all the time. China is CH in the IRS country code, but in the ISO country world, it's Switzerland. And given all of the advisories and alerts that have come out from FinCEN, having that issue could be, depending on how you've set up your monitoring rules, it could be the difference between you being alerted to suspicious activity or a potential illicit actor and not, especially if the CH for China in the IRS world does not translate into China in the ISO world. It gets switched over to Switzerland. So definitely some things to talk about. But this is very much related, of course, to the issue of sanctions. And yesterday, the U.S. Treasury published an enforcement action against a freight forwarder company. So this one is based in Houston. The penalty is pretty small. I think it was like $1.61 million. And, given the total of penalties we've seen so far this year, 236 million, I think, in penalties just from OFAC, I feel like, this penalty, one, there's always things to learn, but two, it's not as, bright and eye-catching as the rest of the penalties. However, it's very unique because it was one transaction, one agreement that this U.S. company had issues with, and it resulted in massive sanctions violations from two different countries, Venezuela and Iran. I posted on this already. I put a couple takeaways for people, but really, I think the main point in this is that the penalty highlights that any U.S. company, again, and I feel like a broken record because I say this a lot, but any U.S. company that is dealing with a product or a client or freight movement or manufacturing or product sourcing or mineral sourcing, affiliates, subsidiaries, whatever, outside of the U.S., you have to understand that other countries do not take our stance. We have the largest sanctions regime in the world. It is the most nuanced. It is not linear. I've been saying this forever, right? The days of do not do business with this known person or known entity or known vessel is over, right? That's 1980, 1990. that was kind of their take on this. The last several years, especially the Russian invasion of Ukraine, really kind of led us down into this nonlinear, very nuanced sanctions program. And that's not just for financial institutions and fintechs and securities firms. It's for every U.S. company and every U.S. person, because that's the sweeping application of U.S. sanctions. The one thing I did not post about in regarding this penalty, but my mind wondered, where were the financial institutions that affected the payments, the almost $1 million in payments that were going on between two sanctioned entities? Well, actually, one a sanctioned entity and one sanctioned Iranian aircraft. And I think it's interesting that, I'm glad that OFAC is penalizing the businesses directly and not necessarily the financial institutions. But I think if your financial institution banked any of these companies, that you have to make sure that you are part of the reporting process. And one of the things that they did talk about in this is that this particular company was not aware of what was going on until another government agency reached out to them. So I'm hoping that this other government agency was aware of this because of the actions of the financial institution that was banking this particular company. That's what I'm hoping, but we will see. I feel like, again, this is a great time for everyone to look at your sanctions compliance framework. Treasury published in 2019. I've posted about it a lot over the years. I've posted the links for the starter package of what the Treasury has to offer. I think for traditional financial institutions, it's a great time to make sure that your compliance, your sanctions compliance program as a whole is taking advantage of some of the public ways in which sanctions is addressed. And by that, I mean, if you have corporate customers like this freight forwarder or like a parts manufacturer, it is okay. And I would encourage you to reach out or have that customer service rep at your financial institution reach out to that corporate customer, especially if you're seeing international payments to higher risk locations. There is nothing wrong. There's nothing illegal. There's no sort of tipping off at all to reach out to these corporate customers and ask them, hey, I see you keep sending, I see that you keep sending payments to, you keep receiving payments from international companies for your products, for your services. I see the invoice numbers. Is there any way you can provide us a copy of your sanctions compliance program? They should have it. If they don't have it, you can point them to the free resource that the Treasury has. But this is something, it's not an AML tipping off at all, right? The sanctions list is a public list of countries, entities, persons, vessels, aircraft, what have you. So there's nothing wrong with asking them. I think that's something that needs to go into the traditional financial institutions, their compliance program, that, hey, when we see corporate customers and they're sending large payments for products overseas, and these countries are not necessarily sanctioned countries, but they're right next to sanctioned countries, we will reach out as part of our due diligence and ask them for their sanctions compliance program. If you need help with that wording, please reach out. I give this information out to my clients for free as part of my relationship with them. I just gave it to two banks and one credit union a few weeks ago, so I'd be happy to help you with some starter language. Speaking of sanctions, continuing on sanctions, I think there's a few more trends to watch out for. The Marshall Islands, the Republic of the Marshall Islands, RMI. Beautiful place. One of the things, though, that isn't great about the Marshall Islands, even though it's gorgeous, is that we've seen a big increase in their inclusion on the country of organization for sanctioned entities. And the Marshallese Trust Company, they have complex organizations, we've seen it kind of in an uptick. In 2023, I believe there was one mention of these Marshallese trust companies. 2024, there was a few more. I posted more details on this about 9 or 10 months ago, so you can go search for that if you're looking for more information. But the point of this is when we're dealing with countries like the Republic of the Marshall Islands, we're seeing an increase in the number of list updates directly tied to the Marshall Islands. And we're seeing them in the Iranian terrorism updates. And there was an update earlier this week where there were 7 new entities listed under the Iranian terrorism program. And 5 of those 7 entities were from the Marshall Islands. And I know that most people know that the Marshall Islands are one of the smallest countries in the world, and they are kind of known, unfortunately, for their Oprah style, like of giving out vessels or giving out flags for vessels. They have over 6,000 or 6,500 vessels with their flag on them, and that's kind of what they've been known for. But unfortunately, they're starting to get known for these trust companies that they're allowing to be established on the island and then being used to facilitate terrorism. And so I think that's something that the government of the Marshall Islands really needs to start taking seriously. I know that there was some language in their last FATF review regarding that. There was some soft language I didn't agree with. I think I also posted on that about 7 months ago that I didn't agree with some of the soft language that the FATF used. But the point of this is to not forget about what I call like gateway countries, like the RMI. And so for fintechs, lendtechs, crypto companies, private wealth, broker dealers, foreign correspondent banks, commercial banks, country of organization matters when you're onboarding a business. I think a lot of times we just go, oh, can you hand me your US business license, or can you hand me, that business license for whatever country that you are in, and they're establishing that relationship. But country of organization matters. It matters greatly, especially if it's from a gateway country like the Republic of the Marshall Islands. So I think it's definitely something to watch out for. Of course, it always makes me wonder what the U.S. Secretary of State organizations are doing, or not doing rather, to ensure that foreign companies that are setting up shop in the U.S. are not linked to higher risk countries like gateway countries. And of course, I'm thinking about our 4 onshore offshore states like Delaware, Wyoming, South Dakota, and Nevada. So that would be great, right? If those Secretary of States for those onshore offshore states actually were taking a hard stance and making sure that individuals using a gateway country, provide that type of country of organization to those states at that level, at that Secretary of State level. All right, so enough with sanctions. I wanted to touch on, before we finalize or before we finish the recording, I wanted to touch on something that I don't think got enough airtime again last week, in the middle of some of the cool stuff that we did, our 2 live episodes. I did post on this, but so go check it out if you need more takeaways. But the Bunq and the Netherlands FIU, I'm going to try and say this, the Nederlandse Bank. I hope I said that right. I tried to tap into my Nordic roots there. But they issued a 2.6 million euro penalty against Bunq, which is a neobank based in the Netherlands. And while I do a lot of breakdowns of penalties and orders, and I have for years, this one particularly stuck out to me, and not because of the length of the consent order, which was 74 pages, or the penalty. The penalty was kind of, not really a lot to move the needle. The reason why it stuck out to me is because everyone and their mom is talking about AI, right? Everything is AI, AI this, AI that. And I've said this a lot in other episodes. 2022 or 2023, Bunq won a legal case to use AI in their financial crime function because the FIU in the Netherlands did not want them using AI in the financial crime function. But they won, and they were allowed to use it, and they've been using it. Simultaneously, NVIDIA touted a model that learns 100 times faster, and there's all these public articles about how Bunq was one of the companies that is using NVIDIA's AI model. And while I have never seen NVIDIA's AI model, I will say that when you read through the order, it should serve as a warning to any financial institution, traditional or not, that their board is all about AI, because in their head, they may not say it, but in their mind, they are thinking, if we deploy AI, I don't have to staff it with humans. That's typically what is going on back here when you hear this big, like push for AI. It's not for the good of the financial crime function. It's because they are tired of paying for humans, so they want to outsource that to AI. And while I think AI does play well in certain capacities within a FinCrime function, AI, and I say this, I've said it for years, AI is only as good as the humans that train it. So when I was reading through this order, I could not help but notice how the FIU in the Netherlands continuously kind of picked at, but did not explicitly address the AI function. In fact, what they looked at were the results from using AI, and they took issue with that. And I will say the 70 plus pages that I read, of course I had to translate it, and I did put that PDF in English on my post. But one of the things that stuck out to me, and I found throughout the complaint, was that there was a regurgitation of transaction activity. That is not a proper alert disposition. And I see this a lot when I'm doing model validations and there's AI deployed in some capacity that's not explainable in these monitoring systems. And they think, oh, I'm going to deploy this AI model so all of our people don't have to disposition all of these alerts. And what ends up happening is a regurgitation of the activity that was alerted in sentence form. Right? It takes all the numbers and all the columns and adds some words to it and makes a couple sentences out of it. And throughout this order, they pick that apart. And I think the reason is because we need critical thinking, hyper suspicious, that's what I call it, hyper suspicious minds, assuming the worst and proving themselves right or wrong. In any case, it could be right or wrong. It's not always, you aren't always right when you get a hunch. But throughout this order, what I saw, picked apart the product of where AI is sitting. And again, please hear me, I'm not anti-AI. I think AI definitely has a role. I've seen it work really well, but I did not see AI working well in some areas. There were a few issues they talked about that alerts did not find. So there was no alert that was generated for discrepancies between the customer-facing question, that information, whether it's email or in person, and the actual activity. I mean, why doesn't AI sit there? That seems like a good place for AI to sit. And then there were no alerts that were generated to address the discrepancies between what were already in the file, what was on file with the customers, and then what was actually happening. And that's kind of similar to the first one, but the order actually divided those two out into two separate issues. But to me, that's exactly where AI should sit. They also talked about how there wasn't enough open source intelligence. That's what I called it. There wasn't enough information about the customer that they could gather online to justify the high dollar amounts that were moving through the bank. And this is something that's been in my, contextual awareness of high-risk customer program, training program I've had for well over a decade. If no one can find you online, how can you generate so much revenue? And I think that's a great question to ask. And I'm not saying that there, aren't obscure businesses and people that are completely word of mouth. There are those. But if you're generating hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in what is supposed to be revenue, but I can't find anything about you online and your address is a single family home, that should be one piece of information that I take that makes me hyper suspicious, and then I have to go prove myself right or wrong throughout my investigation. So there were other issues. I kind of go through a lot of them, but I will say overall, if you're using a template in your alert dispositions, and I see this a lot, especially in community banks, there are templates being used. And you're either having humans fill out that template, or you're using, or you're allowing AI to fill out that template. If the activity that was alerted is not addressed in the template, whether it's by a human or an AI model, your regulators are going to have a problem with it. I think overall, this should be watched, because I think this will play into whether or not Bunq gets to continue their AI to fight financial crime, because they won it a couple years ago. And I think as a result of this order, that it's a good warning for anyone, any financial institution, anywhere in the world. Your board, your executive management is pushing you to use AI. If you cannot deploy AI in an effective manner, trained by hyper suspicious people, if you cannot explain it, if you cannot corral it and say, I only want AI to be in this one particular area, not in this area, but this one particular area, or this area over here. If you don't have that freedom over your AI model to say, I only want it over here on sanctions dispositions, or I only want it running to find those discrepancies between what is actually happening and what the customer stated. If you can't corral it in the way that works best for you, then AI can really be a dangerous thing, because it creates problems like this. And this is where, again, AI is only as good as the humans that train it. And so if your team, is constantly having rose-colored glasses, and they think the best of everyone, then they're training that AI model to also think the best of all of your customers, which could lead to issues like this 2.6 euro penalty, or 2.6 million euro penalty that Bunq got. So I think that's it for my time today. I think it'll be interesting to continue watching both the Marshall Islands uptick in their frequency of when their companies are being on our terrorist Iranian sanctions list, as well as the use of AI in the financial crime function. Both are very interesting to watch. If you have any questions, if you'd like a list of the ISO and IRS country codes, please email us at FinCrimeUnfiltered@illicitedge.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, and I can send it there too at I Follow Dirty Money. Thank you so much for following, and please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll catch you next week.